have our guest speaker, Ahmadiel He's from the African Israelites of Jerusalem. He was meant to have gone back already, but he's extended his stay specifically to give this talk to us today. I'm sure we'll all appreciate it at the end when we go home and listen. But I'll leave it to you now. So, okay. Thank you.
Shalom Aleichem.
Alaikum shalom.
What I said in Hebrew was first giving all honor and praise to the Holy One of Israel, to his anointed, to that government, to those that are in search of a better way. I greet you in the Hebrew tongue, Shalom Aleichem, which is peace unto you.
Likewise.
I guess you probably wonder why is somebody from, it looks like the average African, African American, whatever we call ourselves, everyone speaking Hebrew, and then coming from a place like Israel, with all of what we see in the news and even today, knowing what's going on. But I'll just share with you that the original people of that land look like the majority of you sitting in this audience right now. They were African people. The Bible is an African text. It was written by African prophets, or at least it was they the ones that had the vision, and their scribes penned them in the Hebrew tongue so that we could have access to those writings in this day. If you look up Hebrew, you will find that it is called an Afro-Asiatic language. Israel sits on the African geological tectonic plate. There are many species of animals, birds, that live. Some of the most northernmost boundaries of these species are in Israel and surrounding areas. The Garden of Eden in the scriptures. Okay, we do. Try my hand at this high-tech stuff here. You see you can see the outline of Africa to your far right. See that little outline? It's missing something. It's missing the whole northeast corner of Africa. Just in the last 20 years or so, did it become conscious to the majority of African people that Egypt was in Africa. Am I right or wrong? Right. With the coming of Afrocentric teachings, we reclaimed Egypt for Africa. Mm-hmm. Well, all of that was landlocked prior to the Suez Canal. Israel is a neighbor to ancient Egypt, Kemet. We're talking about an African culture. We're talking about a people that shared ideas, cultural practices. We're talking about being in the center of the Fertile Crescent. The garden in the scriptures that was in the eastern part of Eden, that's identified by 4 rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates are the last 2 that are mentioned, and most Bible scholars have no problem identifying those, and that's where the troops are right now. The U.S. and the UK troops are right now. But they want to throw up their hands and say they don't know where the first 2 rivers are. But the first 2 rivers, and I can prove this, and there's an exhibition I have, and hopefully at some point in the future we'll bring the exhibition here. We'll take a room this size flattened out. I couldn't set it up on the incline there. But it would take a room this size to actually show you these things. But trust me, the first 2 rivers are the Blue and the White Niles. Those are the boundaries of the garden that was eastward in Eden. Now, and that's on your far right-hand side, if we were to have the rest of Africa on that little diagram there. If that is eastward in Eden, then isn't Africa logically Eden? Y'all following me? Give me some feedback now. I need to know if I'm getting across. Eden simply meant paradise. So I'm asking a question today, and I'm glad that the South Bank ACS felt the need for something to go beyond African History Month. Asking the question, who cares about African redemption? And do you? Hopefully your presence here speaks to that you do. But I want to look at another word first, interest. Are you interested? Because before you get to caring for someone, brothers, y'all might care for a sister. But you have to develop an interest in her first. And that interest leads to your caring for her. Are we interested in Africa? Get my message? Maybe those that didn't come today, maybe the problem is they don't identify with Africa. It says they have an identity crisis. They're in denial. I'm not African. Tiger Woods is in denial. Michael Jackson is in denial. We have to laugh, other than that we cry about it, because it's sad. It's really sad that we would destroy ourselves in going that far to deny what is really obvious. And in fact, I like to do this with all my audiences. Everybody here who's an African, raise your hand. Everyone here who's an African, raise your hand. My point is that everybody in this room needs to be raising their hand. Why? Because all humanity came out of Africa. Isn't that what the evidence points to now? The DNA studies? All humanity evolved, and I don't mean evolved from monkeys and apes, I mean evolved as in the migration patterns out of Northeast Africa. That's the current evidence. So I'm talking to an entire body of Africans today. Y'all with me? Yeah. All right. Now, why don't we, I went to St. Croix several years ago, and I was talking to some high school students, and I asked that question. And out of maybe 500 students, I may have gotten 5 hands. And those 5 that were raising their hands, they were looking over their shoulders and were kind of afraid to raise theirs because they knew that their classmates were going to tease them about it. You African, you an African. Why is that? It's obvious because we grew up watching Tarzan movies. We saw the images of the bones in the nose, and we saw you're running around naked and with skirts on made out of grass. And people ask, when someone visits from Kenya or from South Africa, they ask, well, what do you live in a hut? Do you live in a grass shack? Because they haven't seen development like they're used to in these societies. Now, current bombardment on your psyche would include Ebola virus. We've heard of Ebola virus. Terrible disease that has maybe killed 2,000 people in the last 10 to 12 years. You die a horrible death. Your skin just disintegrates. Your organs disintegrate. Let's put it in perspective, though. Every year in America, 500,000 people die from cancer just due to smoking. Another 500,000 people die here in Europe due to the effects of smoking. Let's put these things in perspective. We hear about the crisis in Sudan. We hear about crime. We hear about corruption. Yeah, sure, those things exist. But what do you call the last couple of elections in America, if not corruption at the highest levels? What do you call Enron? We have to have another perception of things. We hear men like Keith Richburg, who was a writer for the Washington Post, who wrote a book called Not Out of Africa. And he wrote about his experiences in Africa, and he talked about the bodies flowing down the rivers in Rwanda. He said, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And he actually went on and thanked, ultimately is what he did. He thanked the fact that he was in America and had been brought there generations prior as a slave. In that manner, he was able to escape that consequence. So all of these things are being filtered through our psyche, and we ultimately hate Africa. We hate who we are. And we have absolutely no interest in Africa. But brothers and sisters, Africa is our future. Africa is all of our future.
Real.
The fact that we don't care doesn't mean that others don't. Right here. In order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced by them in the factories and the mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialist. Well, this is really picking up on what the brother apparently spoke on a couple weeks ago or recently on the root causes of World War I and World War II. How many of you were here for that presentation? Okay, is that basically what he was saying? That World War I was fought over the friction, over the scramble for Africa, and World War II was unfinished business from World War I. Right?
Right.
It's not over. It's not over. Oh, by the way, that was Cecil Rhodes, who was talking about the fact that here in the UK you have no resources. You depend on outside resources to provide jobs, and it was the driving force behind that great migration of people from the UK to points all over the globe. They don't have a problem with that. Been on a plane lately into Africa? Anybody?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. U.S. National Security Council Interdepartmental Group for Africa under the Carter administration in the 1970s. National Security Memorandum number 46. The nationalist liberation movement in Black Africa can act as a catalyst with far-reaching effects on the American Black community. Due weight must be given to the fact that there are 25 million, I don't know where they got that figure, it's much higher, 25 million American blacks whose roots are African and who are consciously or subconsciously sympathizing with African nationalism. I think maybe that figure is low because they're counting all those who are in denial, serious denial. To most Americans, the map of Africa is as unfamiliar as that of Antarctica. Most would not know Mali from Malawi, nor would they have any idea where Somalia is, or Eritrea, much less why events there may be shaping the future of the world. Yet these places and others like them are vital to America's interests and those of the West. Richard Nixon, who we thought was drummed out of office and shamed, but who ultimately went on to become the foreign affairs wise man, soothsayer, prognosticator. He was very much the elder statesman who was still shaping American policy up till his death. The Real War was the title of this book. A little further down, again, Nixon's book. With Africa now a crucible of great power maneuver, we cannot afford to have our Africa policies hostage to the bitter memories still cherished by those who struggled for racial equality in America. We cannot let Africa become a stage on which Americans act out their psychic traumas. Now, what he really said was that blacks who had fought for civil rights in America and were beginning to awaken to the reality of what was going on in Africa, and that the way that America was treating Africa was improper and they needed to get involved. Now, he ain't said nothing. He wrote those 2 sentences, didn't say anything about blacks in America, did he? Real nebulous conversation here, but there are those that study his writings, and these become keys for how they institute their policies. Back again to that National Security Council memorandum, they did not want African Americans to link up with the brothers and sisters on the continent, on the ground. Why? You know the story of Joseph and his brethren? Joseph was sold into slavery. Weren't we in the West who ended up in the West? Weren't we sold into slavery by our brethren? Other than that, you give Europeans a lot of credit. If you think that whites came into Africa and took you out of Africa, you're mistaken. They rode onto the shores, maybe 12 at a time on a rowboat. They made deals with other Africans. They did not go deep into the interior and carry away millions of our people. Ultimately, however, you and I who've been in the West, we hold a key as to what doesn't work for us or for them. More on that later. Nelson Mandela. American imperialism is all the more dangerous because it comes to Africa elaborately disguised. It masquerades as the leader of the free world. Now, granted, Nelson wrote this quite some time ago, but have things changed? Isn't America still purporting to be the leader of the free world? That's why she's over there in Iraq this minute. But I'm leading you somewhere now because somebody's interested in Africa. Somebody cares about Africa. National Review, 1992. In short, the security, let me read this headline first. Wanted a new imperialism. 1992. In short, the Security Council, the United Nations, and its agents will become the last most altruistic and positive of all the imperial powers, restoring to the word colonialism the good name it once enjoyed. In Mediterranean antiquity, no less than the 19th century. When do you think that colonialism had a good name? Ask the Indians back when Britain had their foot on the Indians back in the 17th, 18th century. Ask them if they felt like colonialism was a good thing. Ask those who were in Africa if colonialism was a good thing, that it had a good name. 1992, the European newspaper, May 14, 1992, is the time right for new imperialism. The second time around, Europe might stay a little longer and do the job right. far as I'm concerned, they never left. They never left Africa. Go to Africa today. Look at those who sit in the Supreme Court of the countries of Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Uganda, Bahamas, Jamaica, independent nations. Go to these nations and see if the brothers and sisters who were well taught, law degree, law professors, long-time judicial careers, they're sitting on the Supreme Court and they're wearing powdered wigs and red petticoats from their French and British colonial masters. After 45 plus years of independence, stay a little longer and do the job right. What are they saying here? Y'all with me? Do we care?
Yeah.
The observer. This appeared in April 7, 2002, not long after Blair made a statement framing his worldview. And he was setting the stage for something. He was setting the stage for just what we're talking about. 1992 to 2002. 9/11 gave them the impetus, gave them the reasoning to come in with a vengeance and to implement what's been on the books all along. But they're still forming and trying to craft a language and still checking and prodding every now and then to see, are you conscious? Are you alert? Are you awake? And I'm going to read a couple excerpts here. Thank you. To understand the present, we must first understand the past, for the past is still with us. In the ancient world, order meant empire. Those within the empire had order, culture, and civilization. Outside it lay barbarians, chaos, and disorder. Hear that language? Barbarians, chaos, disorder. It's typical imperialist era, neo-colonial, colonial era language. 2002. This ran in the UK, in the Observer UK publication. The challenge to the postmodern world, they used to call us the third world, which meant there must have been a first and a second world. Well, now they done moved on. They're not in the modern world, they're postmodern. They're a little further on. The challenge to the postmodern world is to get used to the idea of double standards. Among ourselves, we operate on the basis of laws and open cooperative security, G7, NATO, so forth. But when dealing with more old-fashioned kind of states outside the postmodern continent of Europe, we need to revert to the rougher methods of an earlier era. Force, preemptive attack, deception, whatever is necessary to deal with those who still live in the 19th century world of every state for itself. Among ourselves, we keep the law, but when we are operating in the jungle, we must also use the laws of the jungle. In the prolonged period of peace in Europe, there has been a temptation to neglect our defenses, both physical and psychological. What defenses are we talking about here? We're talking about the fact that, like we established in the beginning, that all humanity came out of Africa. And it requires a certain humility to accept that, and then to recognize that if indeed Africa represents the future, it kind of requires you to have to sit down and humble yourself and say that I came from a black man and a black woman. And that's not hard to do in a world that's been built on white superiority. That's a problem, because truth will level the playing field. But the world that we live in is built on these differences that were social Darwinist differences. Y'all know what I'm talking about. That if man evolved from a monkey, then you would have to also agree that certain men evolved higher, further, and faster than did other men. Well, guess who's at the top of that strata? And therefore, we become the jungle. We're still in the jungle. He asks, how should we deal with the pre-modern chaos? To become involved in a zone of chaos is risky. Well, I guess that's what we're looking at in Iraq, isn't it? It's risky. They knew that. The UN knew it. Kofi Annan knew it was risky, warned them, but no, they went charging up in there. If the intervention is prolonged, it may become unsustainable in public opinion. I was down there at the square yesterday outside House of Commons. I saw the protest. If the intervention is unsuccessful, it may be damaging to the government that ordered it. Blair is in some trouble, isn't he? What form should the intervention take? The most logical way to deal with chaos, and the one most employed in the past, is colonization. Can you believe that someone's writing this in 2002? Can you? The handwriting is on the wall. Who cares? But colonization is unacceptable to postmodern states. It is precisely because of the death of imperialism that we are seeing the emergence of the pre-modern world. Empire and imperialism are words that have become a form of abuse in the postmodern world. Today, there are no colonial powers willing to take on the job, though the opportunities, perhaps even the need for colonization, is as great as it ever was in the 19th century. Like the people of India and Africa and Asia needed someone to really come and save and civilize us. We needed that. What is needed then is a new kind of imperialism, one acceptable to a world of human rights and cosmopolitan values. There's some folks that's interested. In the absence of a plan that you have, someone else's plan will unfold for you. They have a plan. What's our plan? I'm not even going to talk about a piece I pulled off the internet yesterday. China's got a plan for Africa. China's all in Africa. You know why? They need oil. They need oil. The friction that led up to World War I and World War II, it's heating up. What about those who care, those that still have that colonized mind? Well educated again to maintain and uphold these systems. Like those powdered wigs I was sharing with you. How is it that we always see the warfare and the crime going on both in Africa and in black neighborhoods, but no African nation, save maybe South Africa, can even manufacture a bullet? What is that about? It's all about a mind, brothers and sisters. Which brings me to this point. Progress. Progress. Talk about crime. Sunday Times, November 7th. High-tech cops blame Johannesburg Badlands. And they talk about how in the CBD, my brother can relate to this one, in the central business district of Johannesburg that had become a ghost town as far as people with income were concerned, and if you were fair-skinned, become a ghost town, and they put cameras in, and they credit the cameras and the high-tech security with having dropped crime 80%. So the article talks all about that, and then it gets to the last paragraph, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It says, one day, this is one of the camera operators, says, one day we looked out and saw prostitutes wandering the streets again. It had been far too violent and dangerous for those girls before. Now they felt safe. It was the first sign of our success. Isn't that a shame? That the sisters are out defiling themselves. And it's a sign, it's looked at as a sign of success. How do we define these things? If the paper tomorrow comes out, if a new hospital is built around the corner, brand new high-tech hospital, 500 new beds, the local papers would say what? That's progress. We're moving forward. We're advancing. Things are getting better. Brothers and sisters, I maintain that that's regress. Because that to me means that there are more people that they expect to be sick and dying that are going to need to be laid up in those beds. Power to define. All about perception, all about how you orient things and how your mind is oriented. I say that the world is going in the wrong direction. We would have to declare that as regress. The day that a hospital is torn down, that's when we'll say it's progress. Brings me to this point, redemption. See, I'm not just up here talking. I'm part of a community that has done some things. Talking is fine. Brothers and sisters, we've been talking for centuries. Those of us that know we're in a situation, and I just talked about those that don't even know we're in a situation, but those who know we're in a situation, we're still in this trap of just talking about what we need to do and where we are. Is the European American model and the way that they define things and what works for them, and I have to question that. I don't think it works for them either. Because we're talking about a society that has polluted their own air, polluted their own water, polluted their own food, killed up the life that is needed to sustain them on the earth, and then has placed people way down the line in terms of values. You can have a homeless person, but you'll park your brand new ride in a garage. Something is wrong with those value systems, with that type of economy. We've gone in the wrong direction. Is that what we want to replicate as African people? I hope not. I think not. Seems like we need a new orientation. Is the European American model applicable for Africa? Do we want to change it? Newsweek. Soul search. Soul search. Is there room for God in a secular Europe? I think there's a reason he's holding his head. He got his head, because you got to know, if you take God out of the equation, and I'm talking to by nature of spiritual people here, If you take God out of the equation, what do you think is going to reign in its place? Just one little quote there. European man has convinced himself that in order to be modern and free, he must be radically secular. Radically secular. Take God completely out of the equation. Brothers and sisters, we maintain that Europe and America are spiritually bankrupt. Yes, they got the wealth. Yes, they've got the military might. Yes, they're running things. At least it looks like that right now. But spiritually, it's not there. And if you know the history of the rise and falls of nations, civilizations, peoples, cultures, if you've done your homework, you would realize that we're living in the middle of a collapse, of an implosion of what looks like the greatest civilization on the planet right now. And if you're not careful and if you don't make a move, you will find yourself in the midst of that implosion when you should have gotten your hat and made a move. Where to? Africa. Africa. With all of the problems Africa's had, with all of the raping and pillaging and snatching of the resources, they still ain't scratched the surface, comparatively. They taught us that Africa was overpopulated, didn't they? Pick up an almanac, brothers and sisters. Pick up an almanac, look at the statistics. Botswana, 3.7 people per square mile. The UK, I think it's like 800 something. The Netherlands, over 1,000 per square mile. Malta, 2,500 per square mile. Who's overpopulated? Nigeria. Nigeria got to be 1 out of every 5 Africans is a Nigerian. You know Nigeria's got to be too crowded. Lagos, maybe. Lagos, definitely. I got a few. Got a couple. $250 some per square mile in Nigeria. Our position that we need a new beginning. That just like you learned playing little blocks when you were a child, you use your little erector set, your little Lego set. And if you built on a shaky foundation, if your foundation wasn't secure, at some point it became reasonable to you as a child, I got to start all over again. Brothers and sisters, this is time for a new beginning. It's a new beginning. It's the end. Biblically, we are living in the latter days, and I don't want to scare nobody with talking about the Bible. I've said in the beginning, it's not a white man's book. The concept of the last days has nothing to do with the end of the entire earth. It is the end of a dominion that is being referred to. It was the end in the days of Noah. It was the end in the beginning, actually, because it said in the beginning that the world was void and without form, right? Wrong. It said in the beginning the world was in chaos and confusion. The Hebrew would give you that more accurate rendering. Chaos and confusion is not the idea of emptiness. Chaos and confusion is what is out here in these streets. We are back again at a new beginning. And in that new beginning, some of us are being called out. There has never been in world history that when those civilizations that had reached great peaks, as they were declining and on their way on their last waning days and last dying, gasping breaths, there's never been an exception to the rule that there was a small number of of those who would leave that land and migrate to a new one that would be the one to rise to take its place. I can say to you that it is Africa's day. It is early yet in the day, but don't you wait for the twilight. Democrats and Republicans, it saddened me to look and see P. Diddy pushing the election so hard that he had t-shirts that made, and anybody here can vouch for this, did you see it too? What did the t-shirt say? It said, vote or what? Die. Now, do you think P. Diddy was saying go out and vote for Bush? Or just exercise your vote? I mean, do you think he was a Bush man? Do you think Kerry really could have helped something? So now that most blacks, being that that's probably the way that they went, polls suggest that and always have for the last several decades, that they voted Democrat. So now that they lost, what should we do if you're African in America? Just go die, right? That's the option that was given. That was the message that was being sent. Vote or die. That's what it's come to in 2004. Y'all laughing, but what choice do you have? Laborers or the Tories? Do you see a real choice? Do you think that do you think if one of you sit in 10 Downing Street that is fixing to change? We're talking about systemic degradation and decadence. We're talking about something that is terminal and cannot be fixed. At that point, I want to show you something. I have a videotape for you. I want you to see the works of those who voted with their feet. We voted with our feet and left the West. We had given America and the West 400 plus years to do the right thing. Either they could not or they would not do the right thing. Either way, brothers and sisters, that left us with no choice. We had to do it for ourselves. What you're going to see is the culmination of what men like Marcus Garvey saw, what they envisioned. Those greats, what the Bob Marley saw. This is a modern day Exodus. And after 37 years, you're going to see little synopsis, because it's kind of hard to convey to you what we've been able to accomplish in 37 years. But this video makes an effort to do that in about 20. Y'all with me? Yeah. Following that, I'll make a few closing comments, and then I'll open the floor to questions.
determination for justice and equality had even deeper historic and prophetic implications, and the ramifications of that simple, bold statement would reverberate across continents as well as centuries.
Carter Ben-Ami was a bus driver in Chicago when in 1966 he had a vision. He was a member of the lost tribes of Israel who ended up in America as part of the slave trade.
In 1966, Ben-Ami received a vision from the angel Gabriel that it was time for the descendants of the biblical Israelites, now known as Black Americans, to return to the Promised Land and establish the kingdom of God, a society that would have at its core universal principles of truth that would be an example to all men. In 1967, he led an exodus of over 300 souls back to Africa, the largest repatriation of African Americans in history. But the movement was far larger than race or politics. It was spiritual, and the spiritual implications did not go unnoticed.
Because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I look over, and I've seen the Promised Land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the Promised Land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
What was the nature of your revelation that caused you to want to return to Israel?
This was not exactly African movement. It was the back to God movement. The difference in our return to the Promised Land and those that preceded us is that ours also coincided with the return unto God.
The first repatriates to the Holy Land were received as new immigrants in 1969.
I had 5 children, and we had today took us to a secluded part of the airport and told us to have a seat while Princess Young was there, while he was making arrangements for us to be accepted under the long return. And so we spent the night there, and people in the airport were bringing us sandwiches and drinks and bottles for the baby, and old people from the airport were crying and they were singing, "The people come home, the people come home." And
these are white Israelis. So wait. White Israelis recognize that you were the people.
But by 1971, the African Hebrew Israelites saw their status revoked. From this point, their leaders' resolve and their faith in him would be tested.
1969, when we first arrived here, the law of return simply said you had to believe that you were a Jew in your heart and worship and keep the laws of the God of Israel in the state. We met the total criteria from December of 1969, but by March of 1970, the law was changed to read that you had to be born of a Jewish mother or convert to Judaism according to halakha, a European form of Judaism. They tried to factor us out of it because now the door was open because we came basing it on biblical truth and not traditions of man.
Without any legal protection, the African Hebrews endured nearly endless attempts at deportation and banishment.
Nearly 1,000 white-robed members of the Black Hebrew sect engaged in a tense standoff with Israeli authorities. The Black Hebrews wanted to march from their Negev desert compound some 75 miles north to Jerusalem. The planned protest was in response to the Israeli government's arrest of 46 cult members last week and targeting them for deportation.
and everybody will be exposed to the country.
I have no intention of making a life, so to speak, here in America. I set my sights and my future development in Israel, and I fully intend to stick with that plan.
We are committed to show the world that not only are we descendants of the biblical Israelites, but we are prepared to face the suffering that goes along with that. We are that forever. We will never be that life.
He makes that statement from jail.
Shut out from virtually every facet of Israeli society, they were forced to look inward, minding their resourcefulness for solutions that would prove innovative, not just for themselves, but ultimately the world.
Every vision requires a visionary. And he had to convince us that it was in our best interest to learn how to share. And guess what? There's not one homeless person in the moment. Nobody lives out in the street. There's not one hungry person in the moment because there's no hunger. We've eradicated, he stopped there, but we've eradicated homelessness and hunger. And so when you begin to see the social as well as the spiritual benefits, we've got a model that we can bring back and show what African Americans can do outside of it.
Despite almost relentless pressure, Ben-Ami's conviction was unwavering, and by 1990, many legal barriers were dropped. Community became renowned as an oasis of social harmony, free of crime, drug abuse, and immorality. They were regarded as an island of sanity by the Israeli media, as well as the Village of Peace, and the U.S. Congress dubbed them the miracle in the desert. But the miracle is real. In their 34 years in the Holy Land, the achievements of the African Hebrew Israelites have become nearly legendary. According to a study conducted on community members by medical researchers from Ahmadiel Medical College and Vanderbilt University, the Hebrews have virtually eradicated obesity, cancer, heart disease, and stroke, diseases that continue to decimate the Western world in alarming numbers. The community is completely vegan and is world-renowned for their unique gourmet cuisine that is free of animal products and preservatives. They own 13 health food outlets, including the award-winning Soul Vegetarian restaurants in Israel, the U.S., the Caribbean, and West Africa. Organic farming in Israel provides up to 60% of their fruits and vegetables, along with 2 tofu manufacturing plants in Israel and Ghana, West Africa, that provide them with their own soy-based products. Ben-Ami's vision for a just society wasn't limited to the community in Israel, however. The Hebrews' record for African development has caused Ben-Ami to be heralded as one of the 50 most influential African leaders of the last century.